All right. Hello, hello. Welcome. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, everyone who's listening. It's Dr. Akin Rambi, psychiatrist and founder at Bright Minds MD, a practice service in New York and New Jersey where we help people with depression and anxiety feel better using fewer medications and wellness practices. I have a wonderful guest, my friend and colleague here with me today who also works in mental health, and I'm going to let her tell us about ourselves. Welcome, Grace. Please tell our listeners about yourself.
So I'm Grace, and I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of New Jersey, and I'm one of the co-founders and practice owners of Arbor Counseling Centers. We're located in Westfield, New Jersey, and like yourself, we primarily work with a lot of folks who are struggling with depression and anxiety, many life transitions as well. So I'm happy to be here today, and thank you so much for having us and creating a space to create awareness on, the importance of mental and emotional wellness. I think for so long, it's been so taboo. And I think it's great that we now are having this space to really talk about the importance of really taking care of our minds. No different, that we might take care of our bodies, having that time to take care of our brain and our mind is super important.
That's right. Thank you so much. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time. So we were talking earlier, and we said that we would talk a bit about boundaries, right? It's people are talking about boundaries a lot more, and the importance of it to maintaining our wellness. So I want to get right into it by asking, what if we had to talk about boundaries? What are those, and what do we mean when we say boundaries in our mental health? What do we mean by that?
Oh man, I think it's a loaded question, and I think when it comes to boundaries, a lot of the times I ask people what they think boundaries are, because I think everybody thinks boundaries are so many different things. For some folks, they think boundaries is just saying no. For others, is setting rules or setting expectations. For some folks, they only think about boundaries in terms of putting up a rule in terms of their relationship. And I think when it comes to boundaries, it's about, how we, what are the expectations in terms of how we want to be treated and how we treat others. I think that there's boundaries in terms of time, in terms of, the energy we give in a relationship. But when it comes to boundaries, I think for the most part, the most important ones are the ones in our relationships and the ones that we have with ourselves, right? Because I think it's not only when we say no, but also to learn when to say yes, and really kind of honing in on that, that gut feeling about trusting yourself on what's helpful and what's harmful. I think that it's easier to set boundaries on other people at times than it is with ourselves. At least that has been my experience. And what I hear from a lot of
Thank you, Grace. And I apologize. I feel like that opening question was a bit of a trap, because boundaries it's so hard to define boundaries. It's so hard to really put it into fewer words, because boundaries apply to several aspects of our lives, our being, our time, our expectations of ourselves. And I recognize that our needs and what we want from ourselves. So I recognize that it's not a very defining it is not a fair question. So apologies for that.
I think it's a valid question, because I think that's I often joke at times with clients about how even my own background. I'm Colombian, and in when we do translations, I kind of joke with them and I say, that I don't even know what the, translation of it is in Spanish, and we'll joke about it, because it's when it translate more like limits, right?
Right.
It's, and I think for me, that is what boundaries are, is creating those limits of safety for yourself. And safety for others. I think that's really where it goes back to. So I think the more we learn about boundaries and setting healthy boundaries for ourselves and other people, it helps create a safe relationship with them in a healthier dynamic in a relationship, whether it's romantic or whether it's, family or friendship or work,
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I'm thinking here, I'm thinking about boundaries in terms of a fence or a gate. And I don't even know if that's a fair way to think about it. But I know that it requires knowing yourself to understand limits. Limits is a fair way, to think about boundaries, right? To think about what are your own limits? How much of yourself do you want to extend, open up? Where your stop and end signs. This applies to relationships. This applies to engagements with people. This applies to work, expectations of ourselves, expectations of others, and so on and so forth. The idea of boundaries kind of permeates pretty much every aspect of our lives, but I think the core of it is knowing for you what you want and what your limits are in all of these spheres. Is that a good way to think about it?
No, absolutely. I think that the other part of it is that we live in a world where there's boundaries all the time, right? Like there's different rules. Like, when you're driving, there's boundaries, right? You got to stop at the stop sign. You got to stop at red. You got to go on green. When you go to a library, there's a boundary in terms of the loudness, right? The environment. You're not going to walk into a library and you're going to start yelling and screaming, right? So I think that there's a lot of boundaries that we learn early on. We learn through our families, we learn through the environment, we learn at school, we learn socially. And I think that one of the things that I try to work with folks is really more on understanding what are the boundaries that maybe have been harmful at times, because a lot of the times we create these boundaries and we're become so conditioned and we don't even realize that that's a boundary that we've set, because maybe it makes us feel safe, or we are gaining some validation from it. This is where some of the work that I do with a lot of folks surrounding codependency, right? Like I think a lot of the times there's this misconception that the idea, especially nowadays, I feel like everybody wants to be super independent and it's not okay to need. And I think I like to try to talk to people we're social creatures, so we do need each other. And that doesn't mean that you're codependent. There's a healthy kind of piece of being able to ask for help and receive help. Which is also very different than you being enmeshed with someone and losing yourself in that relationship. So I think when it comes to boundaries, the reason why I love talking about boundaries with my clients and in general is because I think the more you understand what are your own limits and how you feel safe and what are your needs, the more you're able to communicate that in your relationship, or in your place of work, or as you're kind of moving forward, because it gives you that understanding of what feels safe, and how you want to be treated too. I think that's the other piece. A lot of the times, we end up saying yes to things that we didn't want to do because we think that's the quote unquote right thing to do. So it's kind of trusting yourself. Okay, just because it's right might not mean that it's right for you, and being able to have that conversation with ourselves.
Excellent. Thank you. So you're saying that it's an interesting point actually that I don't think about often, that we grow up with lots of boundaries and limits. You can't yell in the library, you can't stand up, you have to raise your hand. Those are public boundaries. But as we grow older, right, the boundaries we're talking about today really are one's personal boundaries like rules of engagement, essentially for one's own self. So the personal types of boundaries. And as you were talking about it, I was having this image in my head of a fence around a person. And as I'm thinking about boundaries, I'm thinking a home without a fence, because you were talking about safety, right? What feels safe for you, and fences can feel safe, right? Because a house without a fence or wide open gates means that different things can come in and out of it, and that would mean that the individual inside that fence may not feel safe. So while boundaries can provide safety, but it can also be restricting if it's a rigid fence. To your point of saying that sometimes in relationships we have this very rigid boundaries of independence, which does not allow us the flexibility for for dependency. So that's the imagery that was coming in my head as I was listening to you and trying to think of the concept of,
No,
of
I love
boundaries
the
and how
image.
it's applicable. The next
Does
question
defense have a door, right, for you to go in, right?
Say it again. Sorry,
Does defense have a door? Does defense have a door for you to go in, right? Or do we have it all completely surrounded? We're not letting anyone in, but also not letting ourselves out.
But then if it has no door, it becomes a prison, and it becomes restricting, and it no longer probably serves. Because yes, you may feel safety, but then you're losing a lot in terms of engagement in the world. So I would say good boundaries should have doors to let people in and out, and maybe should be flexible, meaning at different points in our lives, we can rethink and say, are these the limits I want now? Can I expand it a little? Can I bring it back in? I feel like it needs to be dynamic, not a static break fence.
Right. No, and I think the other piece of it, kind of like you were saying, the boundaries part are ever changing. I think as we grow as a person, we might make changes in those boundaries. As we open up, as we feel more comfortable with ourselves, you might have a boundary. And I'll use an example that, I think a lot of people might relate. I hear a lot of people say, growing up, I wanted a pet, and my family, we're not open to a pet. And then as they become adults, at one point, it's they're all right, well, no longer, I'm an adult. I'm not living with my family. I can make the decision to have a pet, right? So that's a boundary right there, that you can now have these things that maybe even as a child you were not allowed for different reasons, right? We know the boundary was like that with our parents, but this is now the opportunity. What are the boundaries that we want to create for ourselves? And those might change, right? Or maybe we end up having the dog or the cat, and then we realize, all right, you know what? I tried this, and this is not something I want to do, and I need to create a different boundary in the sense of maybe this having a pet is a boundary that I no longer feel like it's something that I need to have, because I can have it, but this was not something for me. So I think it's also about how we engage with the world. What are the rules that we kind of put up? Sometimes they're rules to protect us. Sometimes they're rules that were in some ways inherited, from our childhood, because we think that that's the rule and that's how things go.
Right. And as we become adults, then we have the liberty or awareness to say, no, I want to operate a little differently, and maybe I want to modify that rule for my own self and my own personal life, because we start to define ourselves and how we want to move in the world in that sense.
Absolutely.
So speaking of a boundary, right? You just highlighted a boundary that a person can change from going into adulthood. That change from childhood to adulthood, right? A boundary that changes because of a change in life stages. What are other kinds of boundaries that you work with people or talk to people about, or are seeing people come for help with, that they need to address to improve the relationships in life as well as their own personal fulfillment and satisfaction?
I think the common ones that come up are, the boundaries in terms of changing from child to an adult. So how your parents view you, I think it's a big one that comes up. This sense of, how do I have a different relationship with my parent? And that's a big one. Another one that I think comes up a lot is the work-life balance. What are the healthier boundaries that I can have at work? How do I disconnect? How do I, have a successful career and still be able to have that life balance for myself? The other boundaries that tends to come up a lot is how do I not lose myself in a relationship? Or a bigger one, because I work primarily with women, is especially if they have decided to embark on the journey of motherhood, is how do I now enter this world of being a mother, or grieving my old self. So I think a lot of the boundaries that I hear a lot that people commonly are working towards, and they don't even realize that it's a boundary thing, is when there's a life transition, a new milestone, or a perceived milestone that they quote unquote should be experiencing, I think comes up a lot.
to where like, I'm this now, I should be this, and I'm not it. Oh, wow, awful.
Right. My current version right now versus the future version or my past version. Like, it's like constantly coming up.
Wow. Are you having any example, like when I like to make our conversations relatable and thinking in terms of someone might be listening, what could be happening in their life right now that could even be a boundary issue that they're not even aware that it is?
I think a common boundary issue, I think it's this kind of level of that I even say as a good way of also like seeing if a person can benefit from like therapy. I often ask them, are you finding yourself like feeling resentful, or as a good way to know whether you're struggling with boundaries, constantly feeling resentful in a relationship, feeling burnt out, wanting to kind of escape your life is a good way of knowing whether you're struggling with boundaries. The oversharing, like a lot of the times people will, they're struggling with a lot of emotional boundaries in the sense of they feel like they're not able to process their emotions, or they can't regulate their emotions, and there's like this oversharing piece, because what ends up happening is when you start talking and you vent, in some ways you're allowing yourself to process the emotion, yet here you are oversharing information with maybe someone that in a relationship where that's not the boundary that you have, in the sense like they're not a person that is a support of you. You just ended up oversharing with like a random person that didn't even ask you about it, right? So like,
so you've opened your gift to a stranger.
Right, and a lot of the times those are like common boundaries issues. Like, people are like, this is when people are looking at you like, okay, what's going on? They just went on a tangent, right? And that person literally just kind of crossed their own boundary, and they crossed that other person's boundary too, because they're not reading those social cues of like, hey, we're not.
Are they comfortable receiving this information?
Right, I'm not comfortable with all of this information. You just kind of, dumped on me. So even sometimes that, I think, like, I like to talk a lot about the emotional boundaries that we have within ourselves, and the emotional boundaries also being able to be aware of other people's emotional boundaries. Sometimes we just dump on people because we're so overwhelmed.
Right. But the people we're dumping on may not be open to receive, and they may not be the right supports for us, because as we dump, they can just either shut their own doors too, put up their boundaries, and for a lot of people that can feel hurtful or upsetting and affect mood and how we perceive ourselves, and create lots of problems that could have been preempted by becoming more aware of our own boundaries, but also other people's boundaries around things. Thank you. That's a good way to think about it. I like that we're talking about this in a very open way and not very rigid way, because boundary issues come up in so many aspects of lives, and sometimes it's hard for people to pinpoint, really hard. An important question: why are boundaries important? And I feel like we've touched on it, but I want to highlight it a little bit. Why is it important to have boundaries around things?
I think they're important because it really goes back to the sense of having an understanding of your expectations of other people. I think for the most part, I think one of the things I talk to people about when they come to therapy, a lot of people end up coming to therapy because they really want to change other people. And I tend to disappoint them, because when I say, hey, I hear you, you're here to change someone else. That person is not here, right? And I remind folks, like, we're not able to change other people's behaviors. We're only in control of ourselves. So I think when it comes to boundaries, what I try to teach them, and then I go back to that piece, is because, we don't have control of other people. We only have control of ourselves. How we react to other people is what we have control of. So really having a good understanding of what are these kind of personal boundaries that we want to have in terms of what do I need, what are my expectations? Because I see a lot of people go into these kind of all or nothing and black and white thinking, like, all right, well then that's it. I'm not going to have expectations, or, because if I don't have expectations, people can't disappoint me. And I try to remind them, like, having expectations is important. You want to know what are the characteristics that you want to have in a relationship. What's the type of relationship you want to have with yourself, right? Who is that person that you are looking to be? You might not be the person in this moment that you would like to be. So what are the boundaries in terms of what am I willing to do to take care of me? And that might mean creating time for myself on a daily basis. What's the boundary that I'm going to set when I create a goal, right? If I'm trying to save money, I'm going to have to set a boundary when it comes to budget, right? And how am I going to have that discipline to stick for it? So I think when it comes to like creating boundaries, I think like the reason is because a lot of the people that are struggling with anxiety, depression, and burnout, or some of these other issues are really because they're struggling setting boundaries and reinforcing them. Because that's the other part. Like, we can be great at setting the boundary, but really have a hard time reinforcing them. If we feel guilty, or we feel like, okay, I'm being too rough, I'm quote unquote not being nice. So then we kind of, backtrack, and then we let go of the boundaries again. And then, all right, it's okay for you to, come over here and bulldoze. So I try to remind people that, we all are looking to we all need boundaries in the sense, because if not, then we're just kind of going to go with whatever our value set is, right? And if I'm not telling you, hey, this is important to me, then how am I going to know that that's not something that you feel uncomfortable? For some folks, like, and even for like you and I, like we've gone to a lot of training in terms of our experience of being able to learn about nonverbal communication and like being able to have that active listening piece. For the most part, a lot of people don't have those skills. And even if you have those skills, it doesn't mean that you're not human and that you're not going to experience this kind of piece of, just not coinciding with values, right? So I think like part of it is understanding that when it comes to boundaries is really for you to be able to lead a life where you feel like you're really your authentic self and you're getting what you want from your relationships and the life in general. So that's, to me, like why I think I love teaching about boundaries and talking about the difference between like porous boundaries, rigid boundaries, and much more healthy boundaries, right? So it's like there's different ones that we can experience, and they can be different with different people.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So just trying to synthesize what I'm learning from you here today, different aspects of boundaries, and thank you for going into all the different areas. So I'm hearing that it's important to set boundaries because boundaries are important to define ourselves and what we want of ourselves and what we can expect of ourselves in the world. They're important in relationships because communicating those boundaries becomes important in setting up expectations of ourselves and of the people in our lives who we're in different types of relationships with as well. So defining the boundaries, communicating the boundaries, and also enforcing the boundaries, because what is the point of defining these things that we want without really enforcing them? Because then if we're not enforcing our boundaries, we're not always going to be true to ourselves, and this can create a bunch of discontent or discomfort from within us. These are kind of like the points that I'm kind of picking up from some of what you're saying. So setting boundaries, defining them, and enforcing them, and also communicating them are things I've picked up from you today. And I imagine that these are some of the things you're teaching people in sessions and helping people come to recognize and perform as you work with them and getting through depression, getting through anxiety, and feeling better about themselves.
Yes, a lot of the work that I do with folks is really I said a lot of the times what I do with clients is really working on understanding what are the boundaries that they want to set. Do they feel like they have poor boundaries? Do they feel they have rigid boundaries? What's their perception and what's other people's perceptions? Because that's the other part of it, right? Like a lot of the times people might say, well, I have great boundaries. I cut people off. And it's like, well, that sounds like a very rigid boundary. It's not saying that sometimes you might not have to let go of relationships. That's might be part of the process of you setting healthy boundaries. But it goes back to, in terms of for you, is how you're feeling about the relationships right now in your life. How do you feel about the relationship that you have with yourself? Are you creating balance? Are you kind of reinforcing the boundaries that you have set? So, for example, like, even for, I think, like one of the things that even for myself in my own personal life is creating boundaries in my work-life balance, right? And it's like, all right, sometimes it's saying I'm not going to see a client after a particular time because I want to make sure that I have enough time for me to unwind myself and to be able to get home at a decent time, right? So it's being able to, like, even knowing some of those pieces. And if I'm willing to, in that moment, let go of that boundary, it's all right, what's the purpose of me moving that boundary? Is it helpful or is it not helpful for me? Am I deciding knowingly that I'm going to move that boundary, and am I okay and willing to do this? So that even if, let's say, I move that boundary, that I'm not going to be feeling resentful and blaming that other person, because then that wouldn't be helpful. Then I just, really let go of my boundary, not for myself, but for that other person.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing with us today about boundaries. I hope that people who have been listening have learned a thing or two that they can apply in their own personal lives regarding boundaries and how to apply them. I want to add a disclaimer that this is not medical advice, and that for everyone who's listening who's having issues in this regard or needing help, please seek out your own therapy. And I should ask Grace, if people need work in this regard and would like to contact you, how can people find you?
Absolutely. They could go to our website, Arbor Counseling Centers, or they can reach out to us via phone. We're also on, social media. They can follow us online. We offer a, free consultation, and we do a lot of free workshops. So that's another way that they can also get to know us a little bit and see if we're a good fit. So absolutely, they could come to our website or give us a call.
Thank you very much. And we'll try to link this in the show notes. If anyone has questions after listening to this, I feel like the conversations about boundaries generate a lot of questions. You can ask them, and if we get a quorum, maybe we can circle back and have some other aspects of this conversation again. Thank you again, and thank you for spending the time with us, Grace. Thank you for sharing. I hope people go and seek out for more help to help with addressing boundary issues that are contributing to anxiety and depression in their lives. I know that I do refer a lot of my clients for therapy to resolve these issues, because again, when we're treating people, there are things that medications do, but there are also aspects of wellness and relationships in our lives relating to people that really contribute to really, really feeling true to ourselves and feeling well and recovering. And addressing these kinds of issues in therapy are a big part of it. That'll be all for today. Again, my name is Dr. Balanli Akinrambi, psychiatrist and founder of Bright Minds MD, a psychiatric practice in New Jersey, where we help people with depression and anxiety and other psychiatric illnesses feel better using fewer medications and wellness practices. Thanks again for listening. I hope you have a wonderful time today. And thanks again, Grace.
Thank you for having us.